All right, with that, let's bring in Dr. Barry Pakes. He is the Program Director in Public Health and Preventive Medicine at the University of Toronto. Dr. Pakes, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon.
All right, so we are going to take some viewer questions in a moment, but first, as you've been listening and our viewers have been following along, there are so many developments today and announcements that we've heard on schools and mask mandates, etc. So why don't we first knock those out of the way before we get to our viewer questions? So first of all, Quebec and BC announced today that masks will be part of the mandatory program when it comes to returning to school, at least in BC for grade 4 and up to 12. So what's your reaction to those decisions?
That's absolutely appropriate. Thankfully, in Ontario, we have never gotten rid of the masks, whether in schools or outside of schools, because we recognize that that's one of the most important tools that we have. And I think we're going to see everyone, not only in Canada, but elsewhere around the world, really coalescing around that. With the Delta variant, I don't think being indoors with someone unmasked and unvaccinated is really reasonable, whether you're in school or any other setting. So I think that's definitely a good move.
All right, and then an interesting approach here in Ontario that we just heard about as well. The province is piloting this take-home test system for high school students that have been exposed to the virus. So how effective could a measure like that be?
Well, I mean, that's why it's being called a pilot. So, we're trying to figure out whether that kind of thing is going to work. And this is for kids who are generally vaccinated. They're, over 12. There's pretty good coverage in most schools in Ontario, depending on where you are. And this is for them to take home a test, do a test if they've been exposed to coronavirus in one of their cohorts or classmates. So we'll see how it goes. The idea is to detect people who, have been exposed and then are going to be positive, and then make sure that they don't come into the school environment. And of course, if the pilot works, then we'll do it more broadly throughout the province. But, that's the kind of thing we'll have to see how it works.
And certainly there are different approaches when we're talking about high school versus elementary school because of the eligibility age of that vaccine itself. So wondering what your take is in terms of efficacy, effectiveness of an approach. Should there be mandatory vaccines within classrooms? We've certainly heard that there are some calling for that if you're 12 and up, why isn't that one of the mandated vaccines? We know there are some others vaccines that are.
Yeah, and that is absolutely something. I can only speak. My understanding is from the Ontario context, but there's a real spectrum of mandatoriness of vaccination or of anything really in our society. There's sort of the mandatory, like we're going to hold you down and give you the needle, and then there's mandatory in which we're making it so difficult for you not to get vaccinated that you really have to get vaccinated. And that's the approach in long-term care facilities in Ontario as opposed to in BC. In BC, they're simply not allowed to work if they're unvaccinated. In Ontario, they just have to submit to regular testing. So, your question about students in schools, there are definitely some non-public schools, and 25% of schools in Ontario are independent. There are many of those schools who are mandating vaccination. If you don't have a vaccine, you're not coming in person to school. Most public or no public boards, as far as I know, have done that. But, there's certainly things that we can do to very strongly encourage it, whether it be sort of social network sort of things, making sure that kids feel that it's really important that they get a vaccine, because if not, they won't be able to participate in certain sports or certain activities, or making it outright mandatory. And we're moving along that spectrum from really mandatory to not so mandatory right now in Ontario throughout Canada. So we'll see how things go. There is still 2 weeks to school, and as cases accelerate, I think there'll be more of a push to a more hard mandatory stance.
All right, and with that, I don't want to use up too much time because we have all of these viewer questions to get to. So let's get to this first question from Robert. And he says, around vaccination passports has to do with COVID survivors. Why wouldn't individuals that contracted COVID-19 as identified by local health units and survived not be eligible for a passport, as there would be proof of immunity on public record?
So that's a great question. And we actually don't know exactly what the details of the vaccine passports are going to be in Canada. Certainly in other countries, Israel, for example, you do get a green pass when you have had COVID in the past. But countries like Israel, the US, the UK have had much higher rates of COVID. And so, as opposed to in Canada, where it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4% have had COVID, in other countries, it can be upwards of 10%. So it's much more relevant to make sure that they have that as part of their system. In other countries as well, Israel is the example we keep using. They have much better data systems, so they would actually be able to incorporate having had COVID in the past, which is a testing piece of data, as opposed to having a vaccine, into this COVID passport system. We'll see how things develop. I think it's critically important, and this may be another question that people are asking very commonly. Even if you have had COVID, you definitely need to get both doses of the vaccine. We have some data that you are somewhat immune. A lot of that is historical data. And with Delta, by the time we figure out whether you're truly protected against Delta, if you've had COVID already, it will be too late. So it's certainly part of our algorithms here in Canada. If you've had COVID, still get both doses of vaccine.
Okay, and let's move on to our next question here from Naomi. And she asks, what is to be expected regarding risk for daycares while adults are protected and start socializing again? Some parents are more careful than others. Dr. Pakes.
Yeah, this has been tough really throughout the pandemic because kids in daycare, they're spreading all kinds of infections all the time, and now COVID as well, of course. And you're definitely right that different people have very different levels of anxiety about regular illnesses and COVID, and certainly that applies to their children. And I think we just need to respect different people's decisions about what they feel comfortable their kid doing. It is really important that they stick within a cohort and not spread it between cohorts, and then you have a whole bunch of daycares having cases. The most important thing, certainly, any kid in daycare, any kid in elementary school who cannot get vaccinated, the most important thing their family can do is get vaccinated, because household transmission is really the leading mode of transmission. If your entire family is vaccinated, your entire social circle, the chance that a child who's unvaccinated would get it is far, far lower.
Okay, and we've got a question next from Marilee, and she asks, if the federal government eventually endorses booster shots to mitigate the growing Delta variant cases among vaccinated Canadians, how does that change the definition of fully vaccinated?
That's another great question, but another one where we're going to have to wait and see. I don't see that happening in the next couple of months, really, where the federal government or any jurisdiction is going to say that only with 3 doses are you fully vaccinated. I think we're going to stick with the 2 doses, certainly for now. But at some point, maybe in the next 6 months to a year, depending on what the science shows us. If the science shows us that you're pretty well protected after 2, but we really need a third for extra protection to make sure that the Delta or any future variant is prevented, then I'm sure we'll have a lot of lead time for that. I don't think any government would consider you not fully vaccinated with 2 doses unless they were making the 3rd dose available to everyone. So something to look forward to in the future, but not a great consideration right now.
And now, unfortunately, this is going to be our final question that I have for you, Dr. Pakes, and this is from Ian, and he asks, what criteria is used to determine the 4th wave of COVID? And I just want to make a point here that some provinces are saying they are in the 4th wave, and other provinces are saying that, it's approaching, or other parts of the country are in the 4th wave. So to his point, Ian asks, what criteria is used to determine whether or not we're in that?
Right, another good question. So, we haven't had a strict definition of what a wave is. It's not like a strictly defined epidemiologic term. We have enough terms like that in epidemiology already. But what we call the 4th wave is just when cases go from being relatively steady to on a pretty steep increase. And pretty much around the entire country, we've seen that. In Ontario, we were around the 100 to 200 cases, and now we're up at 600-700. And around the country, we were around 400 to 500 cases every day for a good month. And now we're up around the 2,000 case mark or even higher. So, that's what we mean by a wave, is that you've got this sort of ripple that it looks like it's going steeply upwards and an increasing number of cases. And I think there's really no doubt around the entire country that we are in the beginnings of a 4th wave. Is there a specific point that we're going to say that we're there? I don't think anyone's going to be, very particular about that. We need to be increasing our measures to protect the entire public, including vaccinations and public health measures right now, regardless of how we define it.
Well, thank you again so much for your time today, Dr. Pakes. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Nice talking to you.